Hello again. Today, this is the second video on the immune system. We are going to answer the question of how did this cytotoxic T cell know to have this receptor for some sort of spike protein in a virus we've never seen before. So we'll look at that. We'll look at how B cells make antibodies, and we'll look at vaccines as well. So back to this cytotoxic T cell. It turns out when your body is making cytotoxic T cells, by the way, they're called T cells because they mature in your thymus, not your thyroid, but your thymus. Your thymus sits on top of your heart. And so B cells mature in your bone marrow, and T cells, it's thought, start in your bone marrow, move up to your thymus, and then they mature in your thymus, so we call them T cells. So whenever our body is making cytotoxic T cells, it builds these receptors at random. So back to my analogy that I left you with on the last video, somebody's going to ship me a key. Here's the key, that spike protein. So I'll use the red one. I now have to make a lock. Before I ever see this, I have to have a lock ready that fits this. So what could I possibly do? I just, for the next month, make as many locks at random as I can. Every possible combination I can think of. And then hopefully one of them fits. That's how it works, which sounds ridiculous. So my body is making cytotoxic T cells. It makes B cells. We'll learn about those later. Again, possibly today or during this video. So it's making those receptors at random. So many cytotoxic T cells go around with a receptor, a lock, and they never find their mate. They're what they call naive cells. So by chance, my cytotoxic T cell happens to have a receptor that fits. This is why it might take several days before a cytotoxic T cell with the right receptor bumps into a cell infected with the complementary protein. So we make them at random. So by chance, maybe I've got like 3 or 4 of these. I have no idea what normal is. I'm just picking a low number. So maybe it's 10 that we've made by chance. Again, if I'm making millions of random locks, if I'm making them truly at random, probably a few of the locks that I make will be identical to each other. So maybe I've got 3 or 4 cytotoxic T cells, or maybe it's 10, maybe it's 15, but it's not like millions. Let's say I've got 3 or 4 cytotoxic T cells that happen to fit that. Well, as soon as they find their mate, what will actually happen before it does its killing and before it sends out perforin to kill or turns on the apoptosis sequence, it will clone itself. So it's going to make copies. And what's interesting is this. Some copies go to work. You don't have to know the name, you can just say they go to work. But they call them effector cells. Other ones, and this is a name that I would want you to know, are called memory cells. So I'll have some cytotoxic T cells that are what we call memory cytotoxic T cells, and then I have some that are called effector cells. Again, if you've studied B cells at all, if anybody watching this has, same thing happens with B cells. Some go to work immediately, they call them plasma cells, and some are memory. So we make tons of copies. How many? I don't know. So I'm just going to say millions. So I'll go times 10 to the 6th for a million, and then times 10 to the 6th for a million. Now, if I've got millions of these floating around, then now I'm going to start bumping into these infected lung cells more often, right? If I've got 3 or 4 security guards patrolling the area, I'm going to catch some bad guys. But if I have a million, I'm going to catch more bad guys. So I start catching bad guys quicker. And now my body is starting to kind of win the war, so to speak. For a long time, I was infected. These cells became virus factories. They start barfing out all these viruses. Those viruses all go and convert other cells into virus factories. And I'm losing, I'm getting sicker and sicker. But now, maybe I'm getting ready to turn the corner. Then we have memory cells for later. This is why the next time I get infected, I am less likely to get sick, because now instead of having 3 or 4 of these cells hanging around, I have maybe a million memory cells, maybe 10,000 of them hang around. So let's say that this year I get sick with, I'm going to go with something I know, flu. We don't know for sure if SARS-CoV-2 is going to come back every year, every 5 years, or every 20 years. So I'm going to pick something that we're more familiar with, flu. Flu comes back every year. So now, if I get hit with the flu, then I'll make memory cells, And if I get hit with the flu a month later, I've already got memory cells, so I destroy it. The first time that I get, again, pretend this is the flu, the first time I get the flu, the reason I get so sick is because I only have 3 or 4 people that are really good at killing the flu. But once I have memory cells that hang out and wait for the next infection in the future, now I have millions of people waiting to get infected again. So now our defense is ready. So effector cells go to work right now. Memory cells are just made and they just sit on the sideline for a future infection. It's almost like if you're playing a sport and somebody comes up with a great offensive play, you're on defense. They come up with a great offensive play and you get burned. Then you're like, all right, now you come up with a game plan for if that ever happens again. And the next time that offense lines up that way and you know what play they're going to run, now you're ready. You know what they're going to do. That's what memory cells are for. Okay, hold that thought for a second. This is what makes the immune system difficult, is while this is going on, there's another kind of little war type thing going on. Kind of like with our military. If we were invaded by somebody, you know, the Army is doing all this, but at the same time, the Navy is doing this and the Air Force is doing this. So meanwhile, at the same time, we can activate what are called B cells. B cells have receptors also, just like how cytotoxic T cells have receptors, they have receptors as well. So we aren't going to get into how they get activated. If I do make some AP Bio versions of this video, we will talk about how they get activated. But essentially what will happen is when a B cell bumps into this bad guy and he has a receptor that fits it, then he will now be activated. So if he bumps into a spike protein, he's activated. Again, there's more to it, but that's good for us for right now. And what the B cell will do is same thing. He'll make copies. Some of those copies are effector cells. And for whatever reason, they don't just call them B cells that are working, they call them plasma cells. So I'm not too worried about that name, but working B cells are called plasma cells. And then some of them will be memory cells for another day. So here's why you'll find this interesting. Each B cell just has one type of receptor on it. So by chance, made at random, this B cell has a receptor that happens to fit that spike protein. So this B cell can fight SARS-CoV-2. Whenever a B cell becomes active, what it does is it starts spitting out those receptor proteins. So these receptors, it starts like letting them loose. So they're no longer stuck in the membrane, they're loose and flying around. And when they're loose and flying around, they're called antibodies. So you might not be able to see that because I have horrible small handwriting, but it says antibodies. Not antibiotics, that's different. That's a drug. These are antibodies, they're proteins. And that protein is specific for COVID-19. I'm sorry, SARS-CoV-2 that causes COVID-19. So now what will happen is these guys start sticking to to SARS-CoV-2. So here's my SARS. I'm just going to make it red all the way around. Here's my SARS-CoV-2. That antibody will stick to that. Here's another SARS-CoV-2. One of these antibodies will stick to it. And those antibodies are basically marking this for death. I have other cells that go and eat anything covered in antibodies, but those antibodies are basically kind of like, instead of putting a for sale sign in front of your yard, it's a kill me sign. And so this sign is basically saying, kill me. I know, kind of violent. And so now my immune system knows to attack that and attack that. When this happens, as long as I'm not dead yet, as this is happening, that's when I start getting way better. When I start having thousands or millions of cytotoxic T cells and millions of B cells, each secreting millions of antibodies, that's when I turn the corner and I start getting better. But I've got memory B cells. They're ready for a fight another day. And this explains how vaccines work. So let's say that we're able to, let me describe again a flu vaccine because we know how that works. Actually, let me back up. Let's pretend that SARS-CoV-2 is seasonal. I'm not saying it is, but I've already got all these pictures with the right kind of shapes for SARS-CoV-2. So let's pretend that it comes back every year, kind of like flu does. Okay, so what will happen is if I want to make a vaccine, I can basically just take some SARS-CoV-2. So here's some SARS-CoV-2. And I could destroy it. I can't kill it because it's a virus, it's not alive. But I could just have bits of that protein floating around. So what will happen is, let's say that I managed to not get SARS-CoV-2 this year. And let's say 12, 16, 18 months from now, they come out with a vaccine after they've tested it on lab animals and such, and then now they test it on humans, we're also animals, and I get an injection. The way that that will make me immune is it's injecting bits of SARS-CoV-2 into me. Now it's destroyed possibly. Sometimes, some vaccines, they just give you a really, really small amount, a non-lethal amount. But the version that I'm going to talk about is if we have a destroyed version. So now I get injected with a bunch of that. That can't harm me. Now I might have a reaction to it, kind of like allergies, just like pollen can't harm me. It's plant sperm. But whenever I breathe it in, I might start having a runny nose and some symptoms. Whenever I get a vaccine like this, I might have some symptoms because my body's reacting to it, but it's not actually, the virus is not actually harming me. So when you inject me with that as a vaccine, then now my cytotoxic T cells will bump into it. They'll start making copies. They'll have some that go and fight, although there's nobody to fight really. And then they'll have some memory cells. My B cells will start making antibodies, and they'll also make memory B cells. And I might have millions of them. 10 to the 6th is a million. So now, let's say I get the SARS vaccine 18 months from now, pow. And then the SARS-CoV-2, I get the SARS-CoV-2 vaccine 18 months from now. So we'll just call that a little bit more than 18 months. So we'll say 2022. All right, cool. Then in 2023, let's say that I'm exposed to SARS-CoV-2, and it doesn't mutate very fast, let's say. Then now, I've already got memory cells. I've already got this and this, so I never get sick. Right now, the reason why if I'm exposed to SARS-CoV-2, the reason I'm going to get sick is I've got like 3 or 4 dudes right here, and 3 or 4 of these dudes right here that can actually help fight. But that's not good enough. That's like I'm invaded by, let's say, 50,000 people, and I have 3 dudes and 3 dudes that are actually able to fight. We're going to get annihilated. But if I get injected with a virus, like a vaccine, if I get injected with a destroyed version of the virus, I will now go through this process, and I'll have millions of memory cells ready to fight. I'll have millions of these memory cells ready to fight. So now when I get invaded by a few thousand dudes, I can kill them easily. That's how vaccines work. So again, some vaccines, you just get a very, very, very small amount of it. You actually get the live vaccine. But some of them, you just get little bitty broken off pieces, sort of like that. So the last thing that I wanted to mention was, why is it, first of all, why is it called a vaccine? Vaccine, V-A-C-C-I-N-E. It's because the first one came from vaca, a cow. So basically there was a dude, and he noticed that people that were getting smallpox, so smallpox used to kill a lot of people, and we've now eradicated it. We haven't had a case of smallpox in I'm not even sure how many years. I'd have to Google it, but it's been years. Worldwide, not a single case. So we think we've eradicated it from the earth. So there might be some sort of high-level security labs or whatever that have it or whatever. I don't know. So what this guy noticed was people were dying from smallpox, and a certain percentage of the population was dying from smallpox. But then he noticed it seems like dairy farmers or people that basically were around cows a lot were not dying from smallpox. So whatever percentage of the regular population died from smallpox, only this percentage of the population that was in the dairy industry died from smallpox. And so what he thought was, hey, maybe it has something to do with cowpox. Cowpox, cows get cowpox. And he thought maybe because farmers were exposing themselves to cowpox, maybe that made them immune to human smallpox. And so essentially what he did was he would suck the pus out of a cowpox. And a cowpox looks like a little blister. So does smallpox. They look like blisters, like if you got a burn and it would blister up. So he would suck the pus out of a cowpox pox and inject it eventually into people. And then those people became resistant to smallpox. That was the first vaccine, and it came from cows. Spanish for cow is vaca. I'm sure it's something similar in other languages too. So the last thing I wanted to mention about vaccines is, why is it that with like chicken pox, I get a vaccine, or you guys did anyway, when you're like an infant, and now you never get chicken pox. But flu, I have to get a vaccine every year. It's because those proteins on the outside can mutate. So chickenpox mutates super, super slowly. So when I got chickenpox, I was about 2. And it turns out, I'm now 44. So it turns out the current version of chickenpox floating around looks similar enough to the one from when I was 2 that my immune system still recognizes it. So I still have memory cells. And that's why even when I'm exposed to chickenpox as an adult, I never get a single pox. Flu's different though. Flu, those proteins on the outside mutate enough from one year to the next as flu cycles around the globe. It mutates from one year to the next enough to where my immune system doesn't recognize it anymore. So now I might have memory cells for the flu of 2015, but the flu of 2016 looks different enough to where my memory cells aren't very good at spotting it. Now I might have some immunity. It might bind to the proteins a little bit, so I have slight immunity. And that's why it's not going to wipe me out. That's why it's seasonal flu. But every once in a while, you get something that's new. It's new enough that we have zero immunity to it, like SARS-CoV-2. And that's why SARS-CoV-2 is killing people, because we have no natural immunity to it. If it was a tweaked version of the flu of 2016, then most of us have either had a flu of 2016 vaccine or we got it, so we have some immunity to it. The flu of 2016 versus 17 versus 18, if I have immunity to 2016, I might still have some immunity to 2017. I still recognize it a little bit. But SARS-CoV-2 is new. We'll learn in future videos, we don't think it came from humans. We think that maybe it came from bats to a thing called a pangolin. The hell is a pangolin? Picture an anteater, but it has spikes, kind of like a reptile. And it curls up like an armadillo, and it sprays stink like a skunk. But ironically, it's not related to any of those. It's a mammal, even though it looks like a reptile, and it's more closely related to dogs, cats, and bears than an armadillo, a skunk, or an anteater. We'll actually see pictures of them in future videos. So again, quick summary is the reason vaccines work is I'm now exposed to these particular proteins so that I now have a chance to kind of like learn the plays. It's almost like a vaccine would be like, hey, on the next down, that offense is going to run this play, so study this play. And you're like, all right, we're going to build up everybody to defend against that. All right, run the play, and now I can defend against it. That's what's happening. I give you these proteins in a vaccine. Now you go through the process of making millions of guys that are good at fighting that. And now whenever you get hit with the real thing, you've already got millions of cells ready to go. The memory cells are the ones that might last for years. You can build up memory cells against just particular chemicals too. It doesn't have to be the virus itself. Sometimes your immunity starts to wane in certain types of diseases. So my number of memory cells gets lower and lower and lower. And so that's why you get a booster shot. Like tetanus. I'll have to double check, but I think the reason that we kind of wane on tetanus is because tetanus we're actually making a vaccine for the chemical as opposed to the thing infecting us. It's the chemical that's actually causing tetanus. So you might have to get a booster every 6, 8, 10 years or something like that. All right, thanks for hanging out and learning about vaccines. Our next videos, we'll start focusing a little bit more on COVID. And do we think that it might come back like every year, kind of like the seasonal flu? Are we flattening the curve? How contagious is it? How does that compare with the flu or measles or something like that? So, thanks.